ordinance can be structured to really start from more general to more specific regulations as you move through the body of the ordinance. Combining some very short articles, really we try to approach the zoning ordinance in like a book, where the articles represent chapters. And so we try to organize it in a way that is a little bit more similar to that. One of the things that we often recommend is to break up, rather than have all of the district regulations in one article, to break that up into 2 or 3 different articles, because typically somebody who's interested in looking at what the regulations are for the residential district don't really care what's permitted in your manufacturing district or one of your business districts. They want to look at what's allowed, not allowed, what are the restrictions in that R zone. So by having them organized into separate articles, it makes it easier to find that kind of information. We've put together a suggested outline numbering system. It's going to be a little bit more consistent than what you have now. There are some problems with the numbering system that can make it a little bit confusing to find things, and so we've put together a structure that we hope will be a little bit easier, more consistent as the ordinance, for readers to understand and know where they are in the document, and just some general recommendations to make it a little bit more concise, terminology more consistent. One of the things that is really important for that is sort of missing in Prattle's ordinance today is that zoning districts do not always have a statement describing their purpose. And this can be important not only for how it is administered and when the Planning Commission and Council are considering rezoning, but it can also be important to if a zoning issue ever has to go to court, and sometimes the purpose statement can be very important to resolving those kinds of issues. So we have, as we've gone through the ordinance, we've tried to draft some statements to make sure that each zoning district has one of those. Consistent terminology is really critical, and where possible, defining long terms and giving them nicknames, if you will, that can be used that are a little bit briefer in the body of the ordinance. Sometimes the zoning ordinance will specify fees for certain types of permits or applications, and if those are included in the zoning ordinance, then to change them requires that it go through the Planning Commission and the Council to change those fees. So we typically recommend that cities have a separate fee schedule that doesn't have to go through that same. You don't have to amend the zoning ordinance to change the fees. That's makes it quicker and easier for the city to be able to change fees from time to time.
Yeah, Jason, I also point out you're talking about the numbering or how the sections are labeled. That also kind of makes it easier for amendments in the future, because how it is right now, if a section is 4 pages long, you have to include that whole thing in the ordinance. How these are numbered, nothing is too terribly long. So even when an amendment happens, it's a much shorter thing that has to be amended. So that's a nice feature.
Right. And keeping in mind that ordinances are more and more being viewed electronically, in addition to printed versions of them. When we look at the structure and just the general design of the ordinance, we try to balance out the usability in both of those formats. So it's not designed just specifically so it works well in a PDF or a website, but that there's a reasonable balance between it being user-friendly if it's the printed version and user-friendly if it's the electronic version. So here is the recommended structure that we put together. The Prattville zoning ordinance has been amended a lot and things have been added to different places. The original structure probably made a lot more sense than what you look at today with where things are now. It's a little mix and match with the way that it's been amended. What we've got here is that Article 1 will consolidate 2 articles that are at the beginning of the ordinance today, as well as Article 5, the legal status provisions. Article 2, the recommended Article 2 definitions will include all of that from Article 6 and pull together a lot of other definitions that are throughout the ordinance. Article 3, general regulations, will lay out what the common rules are that apply to most all of the districts, from the foundation, from the zoning ordinance. Uses, lots, yards, and open space, site distance, what are the rules that apply to buildings and structures generally. So all of that's really a common set of rules on which the district regulations are built and then start to apply different rules to different areas. Article 4, the residential districts, that's going to include all of the requirements that applies to the R districts as well as the T districts. And then Article 5, non-residential districts, all of the business, office, manufacturing districts, all of those requirements will be housed in there. The new Article 6 special districts will include your RD1, your FAR district, your PUD, and what's being proposed is a downtown overlay district, which we've been talking with staff about. We'll get into that a bit later. Article 7 is an article devoted to the regulations that apply to specific uses, whether it's patio homes, townhouses, home occupation, multifamily development, and so a lot of those existing regulations that you have would be, for those specific uses, would be reorganized into Article 7, as opposed to each of them having all their own articles or being a section in some other article. All of the use-specific regulations will be in place, organized alphabetically. We're suggesting adding quite a few more use-specific standards, which you'll see some listed here. And so this will be a convenient place anytime the city finds a new use, 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road that has not been previously addressed in the zoning ordinance. It can be added into Article 7 and keep the overall organizational structure very consistent. Article 8, parking and loading standards. Right now, the parking and loading standards are in Article or Section 7 and 8, and then in various parts of Article 7. So we're consolidating all of that into one location. Article 9 will be the new Article sign regulations, which is currently in Article 12. Landscaping will be Article 10, and it'll include not only the landscaping requirements for site and on-street parking areas, but we'll also deal with landscaping buffers and screening. And Article 11, administration and enforcement, will deal with all of your clauses and provisions related to enforcement and amendment of the ordinance and site plan review as well. Article 3, Board of Zoning Adjustment, that will be now housed in Article 12. So that's the proposed new structure for the zoning ordinance. And Scott, I think, provided to you late last week the current draft we have put together for Articles 1 through 4. We've gone through all of this with staff a couple of times, and looking forward to giving you an opportunity to give us some feedback on Articles 1 through 4 today. We've gone through many of the other articles as well, but wanted to focus on Articles 1 through 4 today to give you an opportunity to give us some guidance on updating those portions of the ordinance. Very quickly go through what the primary recommendations are for these, and then we can jump in and have a discussion about any specific points that you either have questions about or you want to give us some suggestions how we can make the draft better. So Article 1, the general provisions, one of the key parts here is adding a statement, a provision that specifies that when property is annexed into the city, that the Planning Commission will make recommendations to the council. The council will establish zoning that is compatible with the comprehensive plan, the existing uses, and adjacent zoning. It doesn't specify that anything that gets annexed in will automatically be agriculture, FAR, or R1, but that during the annexation process, the council will be expected to apply zoning to that property that is compatible with plan existing. The rest of Article 1 is very much the way that those portions of the ordinance work. With a little bit of tweaking here and there, just to make sure it all makes sense. Article 2, definitions. This is a very critical part of the ordinance. Really a lot of the way that an ordinance works hinges on very thorough and well-written definitions, in part because of the possibility that you have to defend, staff has to make interpretations, the Board of Adjustments has to make interpretations of the ordinance. Sometimes staff's interpretation will be appeals to the board. Sometimes you may have situations in which you're having to legally defend a decision that's been made by the city relative to the ordinance. And so having good definitions helps you to be very clear about what the zoning ordinance means, and that there are, as much as possible, there are a few loopholes for things to be misinterpreted or abused because the definitions or the language of the ordinance is vague. We want to take out any of the terms that are obsolete, that are no longer used, or that the words themselves are, for lack of a better description, defunct or old-fashioned, and use more contemporary terminology. Another thing that we try to do is make sure that anytime there are regulations that are, have been written into definitions, we take those regulations and then we put them in the part of the ordinance where it'll be easier and more logical to find them rather than being hidden, if you will, in the definitions. And that can be important because, again, as you are, if you make changes to the ordinance in the future, you're going to look to make changes to the regulations and not always realize that sometimes if you still have some regulations kind of built into the definitions, you may not realize that those are in there, and you might end up with conflict. So always try to put any of the requirements in the appropriate section of the ordinance where it'll be easier to find them, be easier to administer them, and easier to change them in the future if you need to make amendments. Article 3, the general regulations. Again, this is the part of the ordinance that kind of lays out the foundation for what are the rules that apply more or less across the board. One of the things that we've added in here are some criteria for the manufactured homes if they're because you have multiple zones that allow manufactured homes. We have set out some inspection criteria if new manufactured homes are brought in, a new subdivision or an addition to a manufactured home park, or if existing manufactured homes are being replaced. And so that's intended to make sure that any homes that are brought into the community are going to meet minimum standards when they are placed on a site. We've updated site distance requirements and some clearance requirements for sidewalks and driveways. We've added a section called 307, which is requirements for the maintenance of common open spaces and facilities. So whenever a development includes common open spaces or a subdivision that has a clubhouse or any park space or open areas that are jointly owned by the property owners, that there are specific requirements in the zoning ordinance say that there's an expectation that these things are perpetually maintained. It's the responsibility of the property owners association or whatever entity at the time that is built, that there is an expectation of perpetual maintenance, and it's not, so it doesn't fall on the city to have to take over that space at some point in the future.
I was going to add on that, Jason, and we can talk about it when we get there. But so our stormwater requirements in the city now, if you build a new subdivision, you build a detention pond or whatever storm detention facility you have, it requires some type of HOA or some kind of responsible entity as well. So the open space would piggyback together. So all new subdivisions already have some type of legal entity that's going to be responsible for stormwater. So this will be easy to include with that.
Yes, that's very, very paralleled. And then another key element of any zoning ordinance is what do you do with things that don't meet the new requirements? What are something that's grandfathered in, but if something happens to it in the future, at what point does that sort of grandfathered status go away? And so we have taken there were some language in the ordinance that dealt with that We've tried to clarify it and help explain how it applies in different circumstances. The nonconformities allowances tend to, in the existing ordinance, tend to be a little bit more forgiving for residential, so we try to be consistent with that. But provided some triggers that would give you the ability to enforce the zoning requirements in the future on nonconformities, so that over time those things are expected to come into conformity with city policies and zoning requirements. In Article 4 is the sort of proposed new home for all of the residential zoning regulations. We've, of course, with creating it as a new article, it's got a new structure. As I mentioned before, each one of the zoning districts is going to have a purpose statement. So all of the purpose statements for the R classifications are going to be in here, as well as the T classifications. We have suggested that any institutional uses that are permitted in our districts, that there's sort of a cap on size, and that after you get above a certain size, you're going to be required to rezone into another zoning classification, whether that's a business classification or an institutional zoning classification, which is another recommendation is to create an institutional zoning category in the ordinance. So that, that would include churches and schools and fire stations, public facilities of various types. And if you get beyond a certain size, then the expectation would be that you have to rezone that property. You need to find a location that's already has the right zone to fit into it, other than a residential district. I'm not going to go into all of these recommendations in detail, but we have made some excuse me, recommendations in terms of being a little bit more flexible with accessory structures, gauging the allowable area for those based on more on the lot size and the house size, giving a little bit more flexibility for setbacks for carports and portable shares, which was an issue that staff said they had seen problems with in the past or ongoing. In the permitted uses table that you will find in Article 4, there will be some new types of uses that were not previously addressed, which would, and just some examples of that are accessory dwellings, which would be, you'll go by many different names, carriage house, or garage apartment, mother-in-law apartment, many different names, but essentially it's a secondary, smaller structure on a lot that is used for residential. And so we're kind of opening that conversation up to, where should these things be permitted in your residential districts? Bed and breakfasts, another addition to the residential zoning districts. Conservation development or subdivision, which is, we're having a conversation about this a little bit earlier. Conservation development or subdivision is a zoning tool that would allow, if a site has some environmental constraints on it, whether it's steep slopes, floodplains, wetlands, it could be some historic features that there is, either from the standpoint of the community or the developer to say, we think these things need to be conserved, so we want to set aside this portion of the site. It would, the conservation subdivision tool would allow that setting aside of space or setting aside a portion of the site for conservation to not count against the number of lots that could be created in that development. So essentially it allows density averaging. So if you had a site that was 50 acres and your zoning classification would allow you to build 4 lots per acre, in a 50-acre piece of property, you could get about 200 lots. So with the conservation tool, if you set aside 20 or 30 acres because it was floodplain or because it was steep slopes, you would not, that set aside, that conservation area would not count against the number of lots that you're allowed to build. It would, the conservation subdivision tool would allow you to scrunch up the lots a little bit to accommodate that set aside. Cottage housing option, this is an old housing type that has become popular again in different parts of the country. We have, it's been really popular on the West Coast for the last 15 or 20 years, and we've started to see it gain a little bit more popularity in some parts of the state. You may see it in some planned unit developments. We've seen a handful of these being developed in the Birmingham area more recently. One of the images that was in the visual preferencing that we did during the comprehensive plan was of a cottage housing development that was well rated by the folks who took the survey and who were in the meeting. So we wanted to build in an opportunity for those to happen in the higher density residential districts. So they're not suggested to be in the R1 or R2. Essentially, these are smaller lot developments where the majority of the lots front on some type of open space rather than all of them being required to front on a street. They're really ideal types of development for empty nesters and folks who, small family size, retirees, and singles and young couples, mostly, not big families, because of the smaller lots, in that the open space is shared amongst the folks who live in the adjoining homes. Quickly, we've made very few changes in terms of, or suggested changes to the R1 or R2 categories, other than suggesting we talk about whether or not accessory dwellings or other types of uses be allowed in those. But in terms of the front yard setbacks and the minimum lot sizes and all of that have been left as is. The R3, we are looking at some different lot width and lot area requirements based on the way that the lot is configured, in particular in relation to how cars are brought onto and then stored on the lot. This has been proposed in part to respond to the results of the visual preferencing that we did during the comprehensive plan, where many folks indicated that, you know, in reviewing the images in the survey, those where front yards were front yards and not garages and parking lots, you know, those were definitely favored. And we also understood, having attended many planning commission meetings, that R3 is an area of concern for the city in terms of rezoning and current development. So we felt like this was an area, the R3 category, and maybe some of the higher density than the R3. There would be, this is where we would want to really focus in on making some adjustments. In essence, the intent of the changes we're proposing, and we're certainly open to making additional changes to this, that if the front of the property is going to be used for parking cars, including garages, then you're going to need a little more lot width and a little bit more lot area. If you are, if the lot is arranged so that the cars are focused more towards the side of the lot, so they go deeper into the lot along the side of the home, and are not parked out in front, then it does not require as much lot width and overall lot area. And then there's another option with you know, other standards for lot width and lot area if the parking is if it all comes off the back of the property. And the intent is, again, to meet some of the community expectations that we that came out of the comprehensive planning process. That you know, when you get smaller and smaller lots, there is a concern about how the image of these developments are affected by having so much space at the front of the property devoted to driveways and garages. So this is a tool we're looking at and tweaking to try and balance those things out. The R4 multifamily, we've gone through all of that with the multifamily standards so far. The other things that I think we probably need to bring up is that if you look at the draft, in addition to being able to build multifamily developments in the R4, you would also be allowed to build single family, to build duplexes, and other types of residential development there. And they all have different lot width, lot area, and setback standards for each type of housing within the R4. In the R5, the patio garden homes, we've made some additional adjustments to that, very similar to what we were talking about with what I described for the R3, because this is one of those smaller lot, single-family development types, where there is a concern about how much of the front of the lot is devoted to cars and rather than yard. And so the intent is so that if a development, a patio home development occurs, that there's more curb appeal, there's more front yard built in because of the requirements based on the lot configuration. And then the R6 townhouse district, we made a number of changes to this. I think one of the key things here, well, there are probably 2 or 3 things worth mentioning at this point. The current regulations allow a lot of townhouses to be built connected to one another. Is it 20? I can't recall off the top of my head, but what we see in most zoning ordinances is that cities allow up to 8 townhouses, contiguous townhouses. And so we've suggested that be the cap there. There'd be some type of an open space requirement for townhouse developments. And that the front yard, if you're going to put parking in the front, there has to be a limit in terms of how much of the front yard is devoted to parking. The T1 manufactured home subdivision district, we've put in some standards to kind of clarify some things that are not addressed in the ordinance currently, and then also proposed an open space requirement. You'll see this occurring in a couple of these locations in the residential categories. The T2 mobile home condominium district has been very rarely used. It's very vaguely structured. We've suggested that this essentially be removed from the ordinance, that those locations where it is in place, they would still be subject to the T2 requirements until sometime in the future if they're rezoned to another category. Then of course they would become subject to whatever the rules are in that new zoning classification. But because they've been used so rarely, this zoning classification on the zoning map, everything's pretty well covered either by the T1 or the T3. So we're proposing that the T2 kind of goes away, and that those existing properties either stay as they are, and would be subject to the original T2 rules, or at some point in the future they may be rezoned. And then the T3 manufactured home park district, we've made some changes in terms of additions and clarifications to what's required for the manufactured home stands, really clarifying the setbacks and spacing requirements between homes, adding in an open space requirement, adding in a requirement for storm shelters based on the number of homes. And we've also had some discussion with staff about allowing tiny homes to be incorporated into, or tiny home parks or sections of manufactured home parks allow the use of tiny homes in those. And of course excuse me, the tiny homes would have the stands within home park, manufactured home parks for tiny homes would be very different sizes from your manufactured homes. That's part of the reason why they would be required that they be in a separately, separate section of a park devoted specifically to those because of their very different sizes. Okay, well that covers, I think, some of the key changes that we have proposed in the ordinance. I'm going to switch this over to the draft Articles 1 through 4 and would kind of open up the floor to anybody who has questions, or if we could, maybe we'll just start on Article 1 and then move through the remainder of Article 1 through 4. But if anybody has any questions or comments, beginning with Article 1, we'd love to hear them.
Does it look like it? I guess we'll dive right in. You muted yourself, Jason, off of
I did.
Yeah, I guess we can just dive right into one.
I'll quickly kind of walk through the structure of it for everybody. So again, Article 1 is the general provisions. This is where it lays out, here's the Prattville zoning ordinance. Here's its purpose. If there is any conflict with other regulations, or if there's any seeming conflict within the ordinance, that the more restrictive requirement applies, states that this applies to the corporate limits of the city of Prattville, and that any section, clause, provision, or other subdivision of the ordinance is divisible from others if one is found to be invalid, then it doesn't affect any other part of the ordinance, so it affects that part of the ordinance that is invalid. That's a very common clause in city ordinances. And then the listing of the various districts, interpretation, how the district boundaries are laid out in the zoning map and how they're to be interpreted. If there is any question about the exact location of the boundary, then that is determined by the director of the planning department. And then the section that I referenced before about annexed property, when a property is being considered for annexation into the city, it'll be assigned the zoning classification at that time that's based on the comprehensive plan, taking into consideration the existing use and the zoning of the adjoining land, and any subsequent rezoning will follow the procedures of 1104 rezoning. Any questions or comments about that? Pretty straightforward.
Dr. Simmons had a question.
I just had a question, Jason. If someone asked to be annexed in under a pre-zoning, and let's say the planning commission recommends, I don't know, office, and then the city council, of course, is the decision maker, and they change office to business, can the applicant then rescind their application and say, I don't want to be annexed?
I'll attempt to answer. I think annexation has to be at the consent of the owner. And I think that's why Blake, who just left, he's a big fan of the pre-zoning, and I think I like it as well, but that's why they've been doing the pre-zoning. Admittedly, how we do it is pre-zoning and immediately followed as annexation, so I guess I'd have to run down. And but again, the rezoning, they will know what's been advertised, so they can't just switcheroo right at the meeting on the zoning itself.
Oh,
I guess.
okay.
So I guess you would be, they would know before it gets to the meeting where, so our current process is introduce the zoning ordinance at the council, advertise, go through that process. Then at the next council meeting available, the pre-zoning ordinance itself and then the annexation ordinance itself. So if the council's deciding to do a different zoning than what's been recommended by the commission, the applicant would know, because it's been advertised. They're advertising what the ordinance is going to be, the zoning ordinance. So I imagine they could withdraw their annexation application at that time.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right, thanks.
And the intent of this is not to change anything about the pre-zoning. It's really just to, many city zoning ordinances have typically had a section or a rule in them that says whenever any property is annexed into the city of such and such, it will automatically be zoned agriculture or R1, or so this is simply stating that that's not what happens in Prattville, that there will be zoning applied to it at the time that it is annexed, and that it will be appropriate with the comprehensive plan and the existing uses, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I've wondered about that, because that is very common. A lot of cities will say, just anything initially annexed is R1, AG. But if you don't go through the zoning process, I've always wondered how that works. I know your ordinance might say it, but you're not going through the zoning process. So I like this a lot better. Just go ahead and do pre-zone or whatever you want, and then annex, and I like that better.
Okay. Article 2, definitions, is what it says it is. One thing that I will say that just in terms of the way that we approach zoning updates is we try to make them, as I said before, user-friendly. We try to use common language, common terms, so you will find in here that instead of using shall and shall not, we use must, or may not, so that it is, comes off as a bit less stilted, sounds more like, less like legalese, so we try to keep away from using insofar as and here within, and a lot of those phrases that you will only see used in legal documents. We try to approach the zoning ordinance more like an instruction book, but we have to be mindful that it is a set of laws. It is an ordinance, and it must be structured and written in a way that is defensible in law. So we, definitions is a part of that. But just to kind of bring that up, hopefully that in reading through the ordinance, you'll find hopefully that it is at least a little bit easier to digest. Many other ordinances that often have a lot of obscure terminology and legalese in them. But as I said before, the definitions portion of the ordinance is really critical, and so you'll see in here that we have probably a lot more terms defined than you did previously. We have taken out a few terms here and there that are no longer either that were not used in the ordinance but were nonetheless defined, or that the term itself has changed over time to be known. For example, the term house trailer does not appear in the ordinance anymore. The term manufactured home is more accepted, particularly in relationship to Department of Housing and Urban Development that establishes the standards for manufactured housing. So you'll see that some terminology has been updated to be more consistent with more accepted contemporary terms. We've got, I don't know, maybe 20 pages of definitions here. You'll see that there are several that have some illustrations that go alongside them. For example, the different types of dwellings, the single-family detached dwelling. Each house is on its own lot, and single-family attached. Each house is on its own lot, but they're allowed to touch one another alongside lot lines. The zero lot line, each one is detached from the other, but is allowed to touch on a side lot line. The semi-detached, which is very similar to a duplex, except you have a property line running between them where they touch one another. And then you see the duplex where you have the 2 units are all on one undivided lot. And then the multifamily dwelling, which is 5 units on one piece of property. Scott did ask that we include duplexes and or triplexes and quadplexes, which we have added in definitions. We'll add the appropriate graphics to that section as well. Grade level is illustrated, how that is determined as that relates to the height of signs and the height of buildings. I mentioned earlier that institutional uses will now have their own possible zoning category rather than being located in a business district or residential district. You can rezone a piece of property as institutional, and the rationale behind that is there may be something proposed in the future, a large school, a large church, or some type of institutional use, that it would be inappropriate to have it zoned as residential, but at the same time, you don't want to set the precedent as rezoning in this hypothetical location for business or some other use. Perhaps that's not what is indicated in the comprehensive plan, and therefore an institutional zoning category gives you another option so that you are not setting a precedent of rezoning in this particular location for business or non-residential uses. But back to these definitions, we have low intensity, medium intensity, and high intensity institutional categories, so that in your residential districts, the lower intensities would be permitted or allowed by special exception, and then the high intensity, something that's over 25,000 square feet or more than 500 seats in the assembly area, would be considered high intensity. That would be the trigger for having to have that institutional or non-residential zoning. We'll see in this article some diagrams for the lot configurations that that I brought up earlier about the R3 and the higher density residential classifications. Here are what would be considered front-loaded single-family lots. All of these have a driveway located on the front lot line and parking within the front of the property, whether it's in a garage or on a driveway. There are 2 other categories. They're rear-loaded, where you'll see along the street there's no driveway, so all of the access comes from the back of the property, and if there's a driveway, it does not extend all the way through. And then the side-loaded category, where all the driveway and parking is completely located to the side of the home, which is a little different from what you would see in the front-loaded category. And the intent of these illustrations are to distinguish between the 3 different lot configurations, and certainly you could argue that there are others, but these are the 3 main kinds that we've proposed different standards in terms of the lot width and lot area. And this goes back to making sure that if you're doing a front-loaded development, then there is an expectation that a certain amount of the front of the lot is going to be devoted to front yard, and not all driveway, and that along the street there's more yard, there's a balance between yard area and driveway parking. Of course, with the side loaded and rear loaded, they inherently do not have as much parking in driveway and garage in the front. So there is you'll see between the side loaded and the rear loaded, these rear loaded lots are narrower than the side loaded because you have to have that extra room for the driveway to pass along the side of the home, where then the parking is either located behind the front building line or within a garage that's located towards the side or back of the property. And then, of course, with the rear loaded, all of the parking in the driveways occurs toward the back of the property. So the lot requirements that we then have built in for the R3 vary based on those different configurations. Excuse me. Another illustration here that points out something worth noting. We typically classify corner lots into two different types. And this is important in distinguishing how setback requirements apply to them. These and depending on what different communities will use different terms for these. But there's, in essence, we describe a single frontage corner lot where one front lot line is the basis for the front yard. And then you have a dual frontage where both of the front lot lines are associated with a front yard. And the context is really important in determining which is which. We'll see in the single frontage corner lot, on the back side of this corner lot is another corner lot that's facing the opposite direction. So essentially, these are not your typical front yards. They're what we would call a secondary front yard, which might be a little narrower than what would be required on this side. Now here, the dual frontage corner lot, you have on this side of this block, you have houses all facing this street. And then on this side of the block, you have other houses facing this street. Therefore, this has to be a front yard because it lines up with these. And on this side, you have to have a normal front yard because it lines up with the houses over here. But again, over on this side, you don't have houses facing this street. So you would only require a secondary front yard. That's more relevant really with your R3s and your other more smaller lot subdivisions, less critical with your large lot zoning classifications. A illustration to show how a rear lot line applies when you have a unique lot shape. From time to time, you will have lots that end in a point, and so this definition clarifies where the rear setback is measured from. We do mention in here small cell facilities, which is something, an ordinance that the City Council has recently passed, and we are making sure that this, the zoning ordinance is written to align with the standards that have been included in that ordinance. Tiny homes are mentioned in here and defined. Many of these, as you spend time looking through the ordinance, you'll note, especially in the definition section, that most all of the uses that are listed in the district regulations are defined in Article 2. Or there is a category that is defined in Article 2 that they fit within. Anytime the district definition, or sorry, the dictionary definition of a term used in the ordinance works just fine for the ordinance, we don't add another definition for it. We only define those terms where it's necessary to make the ordinance work. We only define those, and where possible, we try to be categorize uses together when their impacts are similar. So, for example, we use retail or general retail to include a lot of different uses that might otherwise be individually listed in the zoning ordinance. I've seen plenty of zoning ordinance that says, retail shops for clothing, shoes, household goods, and on and on and on. A lot of groceries and it's so rather than listing all of those things individually, grocery store, shoe store, clothing store, sporting goods store, we just call it general retail and define it, and all of that stuff fits into that one category. We only try to split hairs in uses when they have different impacts that need to be regulated differently, one to the next. And then towards the end of this article, you'll see the yards and in relationship to the lot lines with the single frontage and dual frontage lots, corner lots, and the interior lots. We use a lot of abbreviations in the ordinance, and all those are listed at the end of Article 2. All right, any questions or comments on Article 2?
Dr. Simmons has one for you.
Yeah, Jason, in the state where I got my real estate license, under the definition of bedroom, it talks about marketing it as a place where one would sleep. But in the state where I got my real estate license, they required that in order to be considered a bedroom, it had to have a window to the exterior of the building. And I don't know if Alabama requires that.
I don't know about real estate, I'm pretty sure residential code does.
The building codes.
Yeah, building code's gonna require the ingress, and Dallas could answer that right when he walks out, but yeah, I'm almost certain it requires a window of a certain size for ingress, egress.
So we
building code
probably,
requires it.
when we tweak this, we'll probably add that to the definition that makes it clear.
Right, yeah, and we can. I don't know if you had to have a clause or not, but yeah, I know building code, I'm fairly certain does require a window to be a bedroom. Because that's why you have these bonus rooms in a lot of
Right.
houses. They're kind of interior, and some people do use them as bedrooms, true, but they don't call them bedrooms because they can't.
And then just one other comment, Jason, on the definition of owner, it talks about person having a legal title or beneficial interest or a contractual right to purchase or an authorized designee. So I see that as really three different things. The owner being the one with the legal title to said property. The person with the contractual right to purchase, I consider that more of a prospective owner. And then the designee is just that. They're an authorized designee to represent the owner, usually with an affidavit. And that's why I'm reluctant, and I'll make my pitch with the Planning Commission that we separate those three definitions, one being the owner one being the prospective owner and one being the designee.
I'm not sure if I even care about a prospective owner.
Well, they usually have to have a contract.
Right.
Or some legal document to come and have standing before
Right.
any of our bodies, otherwise they're just a nobody.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think I'd rather have an owner, you are the owner, or a designated agent. Even if you're contractual, but whatever. Yeah, we had that
But
designation.
a lot of
before.
times, we'll see someone come before us, at least when I was on the Board of Zoning, saying, I have a contract to purchase, and I want to purchase this only if you grant me X. So that's why they end up coming and not the owner.
Right, yeah, and a lot of rezonings.
Yeah, I just like to see those separated rather than all three things lumped under the word owner, when they're not really the owner.
But the owner would still be the applicant.
So sometimes they designate somebody to do all the legwork.
I understand an agent, but
And sometimes they act as the applicant. They do. And most of our applications have applicant and
Or
owner.
petitioner, we
Or,
call
yeah,
them.
in fact, yeah, that was one of the things we added in the applicant definition, also known as petitioner, because yeah, we use both terms. But our applications, usually they have an applicant spot and an owner spot. Often they're the same, but a lot of commercial ones you'll see, somebody come in and do all the legwork to rezone, and then they'll turn around and buy it.
Right.
But the owner's like, you know, you do whatever, just, you gotta do all the work. I'll sign the
yeah,
form for you.
yeah,
So.
understand. Okay.
Right, yeah, I think that, the zoning ordinance is usually either referring to the owner or to the applicant. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not. I think that's probably where we need to make sure that the definition of owner is consistent with how those two terms are used in the ordinance. Where it clearly needs to be the owner and the person who has the title to the property, that needs to be sorted out separately from the applicant.
Yeah.
I had one question. Fowl. I think it's becoming real trendy. I have a daughter-in-law who has 5 chickens in her backyard.
What's her address?
They live here. You know, how is that regulated? And this is more for my own application, being a newcomer. I mean, is it pets like that, you know, kept, you know, primarily just for, as a pet, and I guess the byproduct would be eggs. Is that regulated under this, or is that somewhere else?
I'll answer a part of that, and then Scott can follow up with any additional information. So, under the terms of the ordinance, the way it's being structured, we're including in a potential allowance for people to be able to keep a limited number of chickens in residential districts, meeting certain standards, setbacks, and coops, and so on and so forth. Beyond that, you would have to be in the FAR district to be able to have chickens, turkeys, geese, quail, geese, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
Yeah, I think our current regulations are pretty loose on livestock. You know, I think you got to be a certain distance and things like that.
Well, for the most part, they don't regulate the animal.
Yeah.
Our current code, and not just zoning code, but city code, regulates the coops and the facilities and the structures, things like that.
I don't know if it even regulates the coop, does it?
Noxious fumes.
Yeah, that
and
kind of
those
thing.
kind
Yeah,
of things.
if you're creating that nuisance, code
Right.
enforcement kind of gets involved.
Yeah.
And of course, we'll see later, but this has, the proposed has distance from property lines and size of coops and number of chickens. You know, if you own 5 acres, you probably have more
Yeah,
chickens
sure,
than if you have a half-acre lot, so.
Where I came from, it was 5 hens and no Could not have a rooster?
No roosters, right, yeah, no roosters in there.
No
roosters.
Well, I think in essence, as it stands right now with the code across the board, you can pretty much have any animal you want in the city.
Are we going to
Almost
change that?
about no
Yeah, that's what,
restriction.
yeah.
In city code, no real restriction on that. Now, again, you get into the, smelly whatever
Yeah.
habitat, then you might have a problem, you might have code violations. But, because we've gotten that call multiple times since I've been here, can I have chickens or horses here or whatever? Well, by zoning code, yes, but be aware of what structure you have and the other aspects of not just the horse or the chicken.
Okay, interesting.
Are we gonna regulate goats?
I can't remember, what do we have for other like livestock? Is that allowed, is that allowed in ADR zones?
Well, if you're keeping them for agricultural purposes, then that's only going to be allowed, in the FAR zone. So it's really going to depend on not so much what the animal is or how many you have, so much as what are you, why do you have them? What are you doing with them? Let's see, for definite, agriculture, production, storage, keeping, harvesting, grading, packaging, processing, boarding, or maintenance for sale, lease, personal use, plants and animals, including what I alluded to. So that all, if you are keeping, raising, and breeding livestock, bees and apiary products for animals, et cetera, then that falls under the agricultural category, and therefore that is only permitted in the FAR district, except for the carve out that we have for the 5 or 6 chickens, no roosters. And bees.
I guess there are some folks that might be R1 that have 5 or 6 acres and, I don't know if there's acreage rules, but if they have that much, maybe they need to be FAR and not R1 or R2.
Or we could consider an allowance, once you, if you have a 5 or 10 acre R1 lot,
Yeah.
and you're a certain distance from, those kind of things, that might be something to allow.
Not that I have any family members that have
It's called
pigs by the golf course.
And just for everybody's, now, I have been sharing this with code enforcement, they deal with, we get plenty of complaints, but they deal with the majority of like, my neighbor's whatever, making noise, my neighbor's dog's barking, or, trailers parking, I'm getting some feedback from them to what kind of things do we need to consider, or clarify, or loosen up on, or tighten down on, so I have been talking to them, so.
We have, I'm thinking all neighborhoods, we have the chickens and the goats. Even the potbelly pigs.
My place came with looks like you left your pig. Oh no, this year's, it stayed there for years. You could- I mean, it was wild.
And for, and I know Jason kind of went through this quick, send comments in, and we'll, again, I don't know if I was on mute or not, Jason, but I was telling them that the planning, the regular meeting for June, we only have one agenda item, it's one subdivision that I hope is simple. So we'll probably take advantage of that and either continue finishing out what we're doing, or talk about any changes to the proposed language, or move to future articles as well, so.
Okay.
And I'll email out to all the planning commission members around here to send in any kind of comments.
Great. Do you want to move on to Article 3?
I think so.
Again, Article 3 is where the foundation for the district regulations is established. Uses, it specifies that there are uses that are permitted by right.
Hey, Seth, is that music yours? Let me,
He's not in an RV at the beach, is he?
well, hey, real quick out for the room. I know I told the Board of Adjustment about this, but and they were certainly okay with it. But currently, we use the term use on appeal for uses on appeal. We are proposing moving over to the term special exception. That's what's in state code. I don't know where use on appeal came from. I thought it was antiquated, but I think even like the oldest zoning enabling act said use the word special exception. So I'm not sure where Prattville got the term use on appeal, but we are starting to. And again, sometimes a special exception is not necessarily a use, so it doesn't always fit. But that's what a special exception is. What we used to call,
Right.
currently call use on appeal.
Right. Thanks, Scott, for pointing that out. There are permitted uses, there are special exception uses, and anything else is not permitted. So that just kind of lays that out and specifies that there are tables in the rest of the ordinance that lay out how the uses are permitted in the various districts. Lots, yards, and open spaces, there are some rules, either common rules or certain exceptions that are applied really regardless of what zone you're in, and such as the front yard. If you have a double frontage lot, a lot that faces a street on one side and faces another street on the back side, that you have to meet the front yard setback on both of those sides. That's a double frontage lot. And that applies regardless of what zoning category you're in. And if you have a lot in an area that's already developed, and that the buildings or homes adjacent to your lot are different than what the zoning ordinance requires. So if they're a little bit closer to the street than what the zoning district would normally require, then you can use the average of those existing setbacks to set your setback. If you're in a historic neighborhood, the front yards might be a little narrower than what might normally be required. So let's say the homes are 15 or 20 feet off the front lot line, but the district requires you to have 25 feet off. If you're building a new home on a vacant lot there, then you're going to use the zoning ordinance allows you to use the existing setbacks on that street as your requirement, rather than the 25 foot or whatever the zoning district requires. And again, that's something that's going to apply regardless of what district you're in. Parking and loading, primarily here, it's just saying that all the parking and loading requirements are listed in Article 8. So if you want to know about parking and loading, go there to Article 8. Structures, there's a lot in here dealing with if you are building and you need to have access to a public street. If you're proposing to construct a building, you have to have a lot that has access to a public street, or that has some other access by way of an approved private street or easement. The height requirements in the districts don't apply to certain things, and this is very common to barns, silos, steeples, spires, chimneys, flagpoles, et cetera, et cetera. Most of this section is going to really deal with accessory structures and swimming pools, fences and walls. There's a lot in there dealing with each of those. And again, these are things that are going to apply throughout the districts. A lot of what's in here in terms of fences is what's existing. We've done a little bit of cleaning up based on some staff recommendations. Fallout shelters, we named those emergency shelters as a little less antiquated language there. And did clarify that the ordinance stated that fallout shelters could be used for any use that was permitted in the district. We've changed that a little bit, say that they can be, emergency shelters may be temporarily used for a use permitted in the district during a time that an emergency has been designated by the city. So, in other words, if you have an emergency shelter in the B1 district, you can't just open up a restaurant in your emergency shelter. But if there's an emergency, and if you have a business in the B1 or B2 or whatever category, and you have some type of emergency shelter on your property, and your business gets wiped out or damaged during a storm, then hypothetically you could use during an authentic time of emergency, you could use your emergency shelter to operate your business out of on a temporary basis. So we just kind of clarified that language, thinking that's probably what was intended by that part of the ordinance. Here we deal with antennas, satellite dishes, waste containers. A lot of this is existing language in the ordinance. We try to clean up and put all this stuff in sort of one easier to find location. Manufactured homes, as I mentioned before, we have added some inspection criteria that can be used to evaluate manufactured homes when they are proposed to be placed on a site, whether it's in a manufactured home subdivision or a manufactured home park. Certain submittal information that has to be provided to get your permit. But the critical part that we've added here is that to get final approval, the building official has to find that there's no exterior water leaks, presence of mold, softness present interior walls, inadequate vapor retarders, inadequately sealed ducts, missing shingles, uneven roof, or holes in roof, broken windows, holes in floor, buckled uneven floor, deteriorated subfloor, lack of GFCI protection, exposed wiring, inadequate electrical grounding, improper repair of wiring, no smoke detectors, no heating and cooling installed, damaged sheathing. And this is being suggested not so much that we think everybody needs to do this exactly this way, but we have worked with several communities that have wanted to have a little better criteria for dealing with manufactured homes, and so where some cities have said you can't locate a manufactured home in our city unless it's 10 years or if it's more than 10 years old. Well, some manufactured homes that are 10 years or older may have been very well kept and in really great condition. So the age factor is not always a good measure of whether it's in good condition or if it meets standards. So we've put in some inspection criteria, essentially, that regardless of what age a manufactured home is, that your building inspection staff can use to determine whether it is in good condition and can kind of sign off on it so it can be placed in one of your T districts.
Hey, Jason, I just caught something. If we go to 3.0406, fences and walls, you got fences and walls, number 1, generally, number 2, permitted height, number 3, repairs and maintenance. Then number 4 is emergency shelters. That should probably be up.
Right, I see, okay.
Yeah, and then jumping down, I wanted to talk a little bit more about waste container immediately before 3.05, waste containers. And I know we talked about it, I know some of the room are interested in this. This kind of goes back to, I think I texted you months ago about it, but those cardboard containers at Dollar General.
Right.
I just want to make sure that that's understood and included, that that's going to be a good way to prohibit or encourage cleanup or them sticking those somewhere they're not visible from the streets.
Okay. Yeah, that's
Can I interject?
primarily going to be addressed through through Article 10, which deals with the screening. So anything, any kind of structure like that is going to be, either needs to be located away from street view, or if it's in street view, then it's going to have to be screened, which may be landscaping, or it may be putting it in some type of fence or walled enclosure.
Mr. Daniel.
I have somewhat on the subject of manufactured housing. The definition of an RV, we're using the term temporary residential use, I think. And I happen to be an RV owner, and you go to some pretty nice parks, especially in Florida. I don't know that it would be applicable here, where snowbirds are living in RVs for at least 6 or 7 months a year. And I mean, they're pretty nice RVs, I might add. Do we want to think about the term temporary? I mean, what is temporary? Is that an overnight, a couple of weeks? And you go to a KOA camp, which is a pretty big commercial campground all over the country, and you'll have sections where you've got essentially permanent residents living in fifth wheels. And I think there's a KOA up, certainly I don't think it's not one in Prattville, there's one up I-65. So you have those various stages of residency within a commercial campground. And I think by using the word temporary, I think we're limiting or maybe creating some confusion. What have you seen in that, Jason, in your travels?
The limit is going to be, so in what we have discussed in relative to recreational vehicle parks and campgrounds, is that there would be an allowance for up to, I think, trying to remember, I think we said 120 days, it may be more than that, I can't, consecutive days, which, we can make adjustments to that. That would be roughly 4 months. But that would be where that would be what specifies how long is temporary. is that you're allowed to use a recreational vehicle for residential use within an RV park or campground, and that the rule in RV parks or campgrounds is what establishes how long, as opposed to your manufactured home parks, which are for permanent living.
Here's another question for you. I just moved here from Athens, Georgia, and we actually own a lot, a pad, in an RV developed community that was primarily geared towards football season. And the zoning had some kind of weird language, unclear language about how long you could stay there. And so what they came up with, the idea, you can only be there for 3 months or something, but you can take it off for 2 days and come back, and the timer started again. I mean, how do you control that? You got something on wheels, and
I think a lot of state campgrounds are like that,
yeah,
or federal campgrounds or something like that. It's that
yeah. I mean, they all have
they're
certain
allowed
space for a certain period of
120
time.
days or whatever, and people go for 2 days and come right back to their lot.
It's not uncommon though for these things to be sold now. I mean, you're actually you're a fee simple owner to a concrete pad within a community, within an association, and it's you think about modernizing these ordinances. I think that's something we need to think about, because it's becoming more common practice, I believe.
Yeah, and something we hear about, and this, I think this is truly temporary, although maybe a couple of years temporary, is,
Yeah.
I believe like when James Hart is being built, a lot of workers, and this is common, other big industrial or big job sites, workers bring in their very nice fifth wheel, but they're here for 12 months, 18 months. Now, this doesn't apply everywhere, but I know FEMA flood regulations for RV parks, they have some kind of, it's like 90 days, they have some time period, and they're picky about the quick disconnects and everything else, they want you to up and leave when a flood's coming. But yeah, I think it is worth talking more about.
Okay.
Yeah, that's definitely worth talking about a little bit more. And you asked,